Hey there, it's Silver. This is Achilles, Legends Untold. So it has just recently come out of early access. It spent a fair amount of time in there, and I was sort of waiting for it to go through the system to see what it developed into. This is just the kind of game that I would, prefer to wait for like the finished version for, because it's going to depend very heavily on like a depth of content and polish and stuff like that to create a good experience. And well, here we are. So this is a top-down action RPG that's using a lot of Souls-like elements. I'm not sure if I would call it one exactly. I guess it kind of is, really, but it's also not like an exceedingly challenging game, which, I don't necessarily think that a Souls-like has to be challenging. That's not part of the formula that necessarily has to be copied over, but it is still, a decent challenge. It has some light RPG elements and a pretty significantly sized open world, which is sort of its main draw, in my opinion. Its largest sort of aspect as a selling point is probably its world. So you play as you would probably guess, Achilles, and this is sort of like a retelling of Greek myth with some new elements. So it's the story of Achilles, but with a lot of new stuff and some other unfamiliar elements added in, like an alternate retelling, basically. So the open world in this game is Greece, various different parts of Greece, including like the city of Mycenae and a couple of other surrounding areas, the coastline, and also some old ruins and some caves and all sorts of things like that you would expect in sort of a dungeon crawler. So there's a good amount of variety here when it comes to the world that you can explore, and it's a very open game. You have a linear story, of course, a beat-to-beat story that you're meant to follow, but there's also a ton of stuff outside of that you can just sort of wander off at any point and just see what you find. You'll notice that there are a lot of like dungeons and stuff that you'll never actually touch in the main quest line. So when it comes to a game that rewards exploration or is about sort of finding your own fun in the world, this is definitely one of those. And I tend to like that sort of thing. I enjoy exploring every nook and cranny of a map when I can, if there's actually content to be found there. And this game does a pretty good job, in my opinion, of actually putting stuff there. There'll be a chest or a cave or a dungeon or something in every little corner for you to find, so that you're usually well rewarded for just setting out in a direction and seeing what's there. The combat system, though, this is the most Souls-like inspired system that the game has. Its combat is very stamina focused. You have a stamina gauge, of course, that is depleted when you attack and when you dodge, and you're expected to keep an eye on this gauge and measure your attacks against enemies to keep them at bay. And I say keep them at bay because in this combat system you are always heavily outnumbered. You'll find that almost all combat encounters are not 1v1s. They're usually 4 or 5 V1s, especially if there's skeletons or something involved, in which case you might fight a huge swarm of 10 or 12 of them in addition to some other enemies. So this is the sort of Souls-like where you are not really focused on the 1v1 combat experience and is instead about wading through larger groups. But even though the combat does definitely focus heavily on larger groups, there are still moments where you're only fighting a few more powerful enemies or even singular more powerful enemies, so there is still that element of 1v1 against a more complex singular foe kind of idea, especially of course the boss fights. I've noticed that most of the boss fights in this game do not spawn adds, so it's pretty much entirely about just you and the boss. Some bosses will have multiple phases, but I don't think most of them do. Only occasionally will they have multiple phases. But the combat variety is pretty good. So you've got a weapon and a shield, although you can also choose to have a two-handed weapon or 2 one-handed weapons and forego the shield if you'd like. And you have, of course, your light and heavy attacks, and the heavy attacks can be charged for extra damage and extra stamina expenditure. You've got a simple combo system that encourages rhythm, because if you press the attack button in the right rhythm, you spend less stamina per attack, whereas if you kind of cue the attacks off rhythm, then it costs more. If you're using a shield, you can also throw your shield, which actually does a fair amount of damage, but it depends on the kind of shield you're using. Some of them are pretty weak, but focus more on the defensive statistics of being able to block well, whereas others can actually deal more damage, but maybe they're not necessarily as good at blocking. And you can also just press the guard button to return the shield to you, and it can do damage as it returns as well. You've also got 2 active skill slots that you can populate however you'd like. You only start off with just the one of them, and it'll have the Sparta kick in it, which is actually a really useful ability because it breaks guards and stuff very easily and sends people flying. But it won't be long before you're getting other active skills that you can put in this slot, and you can also unlock a second slot very early on. And finally, in addition to all of this, you've of course got your consumable slot. You have 4 consumable slots that you can use at any time, either one on each direction of the D-pad if you're using a controller, or on 1 through 4, the numeral keys if you're using a mouse and keyboard. It does have a bit of a focus on consumables overall. They tend to be quite powerful, and there are a lot of different kinds you can find, so you are encouraged to use them. It uses that sort of the system that games like Bloodborne kind of helped to bring to the fore, which is that you have a limited number of these consumables that you can hold at any given time, but you can have a lot more of them in your storage, and then every time you go back to a checkpoint, it will just automatically repopulate however much you're holding from your storage if you have any to spare. It does use a consumable-based healing system. There is no like Estus Flask, no charge-based heal. That you have like just normal consumable healing potions. This is probably one of the reasons the game isn't super challenging, because it absolutely loads you down with these healing potions. They are very easy to find in very large numbers, and you will pretty much never run out of them. They do have a bit of an animation for drinking them that you have to be able to actually time in between enemy attacks in order to restore health with them, but there are ways to make that animation shorter and make the restoration happen faster as well. Some of the active skills that you can put in those slots can be used regardless of weapon, like there are various auras that you can activate, or the kick and things like that. Those don't need a specific weapon to use, they can be used with anything. But you will sometimes find others that actually do require a specific weapon type, like spears or greatswords or something like that, so if you want to use those you have to actually have the appropriate weapon equipped, and one of the strengths of the game is its variety of equipment. As you're exploring around the world and in dungeons, you'll find treasure chests all over the place, and you have to actually destroy all of the enemies around the treasure chests in order to loot them, because if you're in combat at all, you can't really interact with anything. So if you want to loot the treasures, you got to kill the enemies. You can't just run in and run back out. But one of the most common types of thing you're going to find in these chests are new weapons, and there's a lot of them. There are weapons of various different types, like, short swords, great swords, spears, axes, things like that. And there are also weapons of different stat types and things, so weapons that scale with strength, or weapons that scale with wrath, which is sort of like intelligence. This is like your elemental damage, kind of. Weapons that scale with precision, like spears and other like divine weapons and stuff. So there's definitely a good variety, and you'll also find a lot of weapons that have different enchantments, from damage types like dark and divine damage to the ability to inflict specific status ailments like burning weapons or poison weapons. Each weapon type does have its own set of attacks. You've even got dodge and sprint attacks to help sort of increase the overall combat variety, which is nice. And of course you are encouraged to find weapons whose attacks you like using and whose stats scale with yours very well. So if you're putting a lot of points into strength, then you want to find a high strength scaling weapon. It uses that classic Dark Souls system of having weapons have letters to represent how well they scale with different stats, and that scaling adds damage of different types depending on what sort of weapon you're talking about. It also uses the Dark Souls upgrade system, where you have various different types of metal shards that you can get from killing enemies and opening chests and stuff, just general exploration, and you will use some money, which is drachmas, and some of these shards in order to actually upgrade your weapons, and weapons can be upgraded from +1 all the way up to like +10 or something like that, although at first you won't be able to actually upgrade all the way. You can only go a certain number up depending on how far in the story you are, because as you go through the story, you'll be meeting smiths and unlocking better workshops for those smiths and things, and that will increase the maximum number of upgrades you can put on any individual item. One staple of the Souls-like genre that you will not be finding here are armor sets. You will not be looking around and finding sets of armor or pieces of armor in chests and stuff. Instead, you will very occasionally, at specific points in the story, get a new suit of armor all at once, and that's pretty much it. You won't be finding them all over the place. These can be upgraded, though, so you can upgrade your armor for better defensive and resistance stats. The story is a pretty basic one, but it's a good excuse to romp around ancient Greece and kill things. It will lead you around various Greek areas and some outer islands and stuff in order to uncover what's actually happening to you, why you seem to have come back to life and can't die, who's responsible for that, and what their plans are in regards to what's happening to the world and why Greece seems to be going downhill fast. In terms of like quest variety and stuff, there is a pretty good amount. The main quest is mostly, of course, going to be based around exploring new areas and fighting in new dungeons and things like that in order to progress the storyline. But you'll also find a lot of side quests and stuff that will involve some, usually they're not too fetchy, you know, usually it's not like bring me 10 of these, oftentimes it's more of a case of like examine this area to find out what happened to this person and then fight this mini-boss and then come back to me or something like that. It's not like super involved, but it does involve a good amount of combat and stuff usually. As you kill enemies, you'll get experience, and once your experience gauge maxes out, you will level up, and you'll be able to spend your level up points at the shrines, which are your checkpoints, your bonfires, the shrines of Hades. And the skill tree in this game is huge. It looks like a giant sky filled with constellations, and each sort of star is a node that you can spend a point to unlock. So you can choose to splash some points in a couple of lines in order to get to different constellations and unlock their bonuses, or you can choose to dedicate a bunch of points into only a couple of constellations, because you can actually put multiple points into a node. You can usually unlock a node 3 times in order to increase its stat in a more concentrated way. So most of the nodes in the skill tree will increase your stat by 1 point of whatever stat that node is for, and each constellation is usually full of nodes of one particular stat, so you'll start with like a strength constellation, and then you can move on to like a wrath one and stuff like that in order to pump a really specific stat if you want to. But also the constellations will often have some other sort of passive effects or skills that you can unlock by speccing into them, from things like the ability to restore some of your depleted health when you get hit Bloodborne rally system style, to have your shield bounce between multiple enemies when you call it back, to the ability to timed block an enemy to like perfect guard or parry them. You'll find by exploring the skill tree, you'll find a pretty significant number of these more substantial nodes that unlock different mechanics or improve passive effects you have and things like that. So it's not all about stats. And there are also several constellations which give a significant bonus if you put a point, at least 1 point, into each of the nodes in that constellation. It'll unlock some sort of more significant bonus. This is how you actually get, for instance, that second active skill slot, is by filling out at least 1 point in the starting constellation. There's also a good amount of side content that will give you skill points as a reward. So sometimes you'll find things like these big stone slabs that will be like a dedication to a spirit, and they'll ask for a specific number of a certain like crafting resource, and you can bring that resource back to the slab and then call the spirit home, and that will give you a skill point. You'll also sometimes find these rifts in space, these purple rifts, and these will transport you into a dark arena that will have some very difficult enemies spawn in large waves against you. And if you're able to hold out and kill all the enemies, usually with like a mini-boss at the end, then you can close the rift, and that will also give you a skill point. You also get, at one point in the story, the ability to sort of see hidden things. You get a sort of special vision, and one of the things you can see are these mini-boss enemies that roam around that are only visible when you're using this, and if you kill them, then you get a skill point from them too. They're pretty difficult because they are very fast and very high damage, and also the whole time you're using this special vision, it drains your health, so the whole time you're fighting them, you're actually getting hurt. So yeah, you'll find that there's a pretty good amount of gameplay variety here. There's a fair amount of stuff to do. A lot of it will involve combat because it's a Souls-like, so pretty much the language of the genre is combat. But you will find a good amount of stuff to do. And also the dungeons can be really large, by the way, especially the optional ones. You'll find that they usually have a lot of optional branches in them. They're not just like straight shots to a boss. They tend to have a lot of optional paths and stuff that you can find extra chests in. Oftentimes there are these one chests that have a glowing symbol on top of them, and it'll be split in between 3 different like stone tablets that each have one fraction of the symbol on them, and you gotta find them somewhere in the environment and throw your shield at them to break them. And once you find all 3, then you can unlock the chest, and it usually has something really good in it, like a special weapon or a new skill or something like that. But then eventually you can get back on the main track and fight the boss of the dungeon, and then there will be a nice chest at the end as well as a portal to take you back out more quickly, since they do get quite expansive. So overall, it's got a pretty solid premise for a game, and it does a pretty good job of executing that premise with some competent design. However, I do have some problems with how its formula works out. For one, I mentioned the game isn't really all that challenging, and that's not necessarily a problem, but there is an issue with the way that it sometimes becomes challenging not being a very fun challenge, by which I mean most of the times I died in this game were because I got swarmed by enemies and stun-locked to death. Because you don't really have like a grace period after getting hit and taking damage, it's possible for like 20,000 skeletons to surround you and just keep hitting you, and you can't react. You're just stun-locked, you can't dodge or attack or do anything if they hit you fast enough. So you'll find this easy to get interrupted thing and this easy to get stun locked thing to be a bit of a problem simply due to the large number of enemies the game tends to send at you at one time. A lot of the difficulty in combat doesn't come from challenging enemies as much as it comes from a large number of them easily to sort of breathe on you and cause you to get stun locked. Another criticism I would definitely level at the game in terms of its weaknesses is that the story is very basic. It's an okay story, but the writing kind of lets it down a little bit. It's, you know, I'm a huge fan of Greek mythology. I am like a mythology buff. I read up on like every mythological pantheon I could when I was a kid, so I'm always a fan of being able to play through these mythological time periods. It's just a joy for me. But even though I like that sort of thing, I gotta admit that the overall writing in this game makes it overly simplistic. The writing is not very good. It's also kind of let down by its voice acting, which is also not particularly good. It's almost good in that like hammy, they're chewing the scenery kind of way, but sometimes some characters' delivery doesn't even quite reach that point, and it just is very stilted and wooden, and it makes the simplistic writing stand out a lot more when it's delivered in this kind of basic way. You know, you can have a story that's still fun, but kind of simple. If you go with something like a Dynasty Warriors kind of setup, those stories tend to be very simplistic, but they're delivered with such zeal, and the voice acting is so hilarious that they're still really fun to go through because it's all just over-the-top ridiculous. But this game doesn't quite reach that point. It's too simplistic, but it's also not delivered with the kind of over-the-top silliness you would need in order to make it work. You know, it's a little bit too serious for how sort of simply written it is. I would say if you combine this sort of kind of lackluster story presentation with the fact that it doesn't quite nail all of its combat goals by having a little bit of like weird combat feedback here and there, and mostly good combat, but the occasional bit of frustration with like getting too easily stun locked or having some enemies with really weird hitboxes like the wolves whose attacks seem to just do whatever they want, and the plant enemies having these sort of like constant unblockable, uninterruptible attacks that just sort of come out of nowhere and make the pace of the combat against them sort of grind to a halt. It all creates this sort of confused identity. Like, does it want to be like Diablo or Titan Quest, or does it want to be like Dark Souls? And it doesn't really do either of those things 100%, and it kind of refuses to commit to either or in such a way that it creates a sort of confused game that manages to be a pretty fun time, but doesn't reach the sort of greatness that it could have the possibility to if it committed more to one or the other. It is, I should mention, a pretty good looking and sounding game, by the way. The graphics are, of course, they're not like crazy quadruple A or anything, but it looks good. It's got a nice sense of atmosphere, and its rendition of like the Greek countryside is very pretty and very pleasant to stroll through. And its music and stuff is, although not like super standout, is still pretty good, especially like the exploration music and stuff is a little bit zen, and it creates a nice combination with the visuals to sort of craft that ancient Greece mythology atmosphere that the game is going for. It does a good job at that. So I think, honestly, for the price, I would have to say that this is still a pretty solid pickup if you're a fan of Souls-likes, but don't expect a crazy challenge. It is something that is kept from greatness by some of its flaws, but for $25, it's still a pretty good time in my opinion. And if you're a fan of like action RPGs like this, so like top-down isometric stuff, or just general like third-person action RPGs, then you'll probably find a good amount to like here, because what it does well, it does manage to execute to a pretty satisfying degree. So I'll put the link in the description below this video to the Steam store page, so you can go and check it out on your own time. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.